Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Now let's begin with Story 1. How Castles Kept Out the Cold. You are walking through a medieval castle in the early 14th century. The air is damp. Stone arches rise around you, and your breath fogs with every exhale. You notice how your boots echo on the cold, flagstone floors, even through the thin straw scattered to muffle the sound and add a meager layer of insulation. You might imagine these castles, grand and imposing from the outside, offered warmth and protection from the elements. But the truth is far more practical and far colder. The towering stone walls were excellent at repelling invaders, but they were equally skilled at repelling warmth. Built for defense, not comfort, the average medieval castle was often colder inside than the air outside. The thermal mass of thick stone walls meant they retained the cold long after winter had passed. Without insulation as we know it today, people adapted with routines, materials, and technologies that seem primitive now, but were essential to survival then. Heating the unheatable. Central heating, unheard of. The main method of warming a medieval castle was the open hearth, essentially a large fireplace, often positioned in the Great Hall. But these fires didn't heat the whole castle. Instead, they provided a local zone of bearable warmth, usually surrounded by people huddled close. In the center of the Great Hall, flames leapt skyward into a smoke hood or a hole in the roof. Chimneys didn't become widespread until the 12th century in England and remained a luxury for centuries afterward. Early heating solutions were incredibly inefficient. Much of the heat escaped, but a fire was better than nothing. Servants would carry coals in small metal boxes, warming pans or brazier bowls to other parts of the castle, especially to the bedrooms of the noble family. But the risk of fire was always present, and so these portable heating devices were handled cautiously. Fires were typically extinguished before sleeping. A glowing ember left too long could cause a catastrophe in a timber-roofed building. Safety often meant suffering in the cold. The straw and the stone. Floor coverings were as utilitarian as they were necessary. Rushes or straw were scattered across floors to soak up moisture and provide some thermal buffer. They were rarely cleaned, more often replaced when the stench became too much. Beneath this straw layer, stone floors remained unforgivingly cold. In some well-staffed households, herbs were added to the straw: lavender, mint, or chamomile to mask the ever-present odor of living indoors without sanitation or regular cleaning. But even with such measures, warmth was elusive. People didn't expect to be comfortable. Instead, they expected to endure. They dressed in layers, slept in groups, and considered warmth a fleeting pleasure, not a constant. The hall is the heart. The Great Hall, often the largest room in a castle, functioned as the central communal space, and it was here that the largest fires burned. The nobility would sit closest to the fire, the servants further away. This wasn't just a metaphor for social hierarchy, it was a literal gradient of comfort. Heat, after all, radiated outward and upward. The closer one sat to the fire, the warmer the experience. The food served in the Great Hall: hot stews, roasted meats, mulled ale was not merely about sustenance. It was another method of warming the body. Meals were scheduled strategically, with warm drinks and heavy fare helping fight the internal chill. In the bitterest winters, people might linger in the hall long after meals, unwilling to retreat to their frigid chambers. Evenings were often spent near the hearth. People told stories, sang songs, or worked by candlelight and firelight. The glow of the hearth was not only physical, it was psychological. It represented the only relief from the hard, cold reality of castle life. Chamber fires and personal warmth. In the private chambers of the lord and lady, small fireplaces or hearths might exist, but they were rarely large. Fuel was expensive, wood had to be chopped, hauled, and stored. In forested regions, firewood might be more abundant, but in many parts of medieval Europe, it was a precious commodity. Charcoal, slightly more efficient, was used when possible, but even nobles rationed their heat. Fires in bedrooms were often built only in the evening and extinguished before sleep. Servants would warm the lord's bed using hot stones or iron pans filled with embers, rolled between the sheets before their master arrived. These devices were wrapped in cloth to avoid burning the linens. And then there were bed curtains, a practical invention, not merely decorative. Hung around a four-poster bed, they trapped the sleeper's body heat, creating a microclimate that was several degrees warmer than the rest of the room. The bed itself was often elevated, another insulation trick. Cold air settles low, and so sleeping on the floor meant colder nights. Feather beds, woolen blankets, and layers of linen were used in combination to create warmth through both insulation and entrapment of body heat. Still, one's breath often froze to the interior walls overnight. Shared bodies, shared warmth. Castles weren't just homes for nobility, they were entire communities. Servants, guards, squires, and children all lived within the walls, and while the lord's chamber may have had a modest fire, the lower-ranking inhabitants were less fortunate. They often slept communally in the coldest parts of the building, under staircases, in guard rooms, or even in the halls themselves after the fires had burned low. Sharing warmth was common. 2 or more people might share a bed, regardless of gender or relation. This was not necessarily seen as scandalous. It was practical. A shared body meant a shared source of heat. Blankets were few. Nightcaps were standard, and waking in the middle of the night to turn over straw mattresses or adjust fire pans was expected. In some castle towers or keeps, the outer chambers served almost as buffers, insulating the central rooms from the worst of the wind. These cold, outer rooms might house guards or store food that needed to stay chilled. Their strategic placement showed a keen awareness of how cold affected both living conditions and preservation of supplies. Stone as a legacy. The castles that dot the landscapes of England, France, and Germany today still stand largely because of their stone construction. But inside, these buildings tell another story, a story of relentless cold and the people who endured it. Their solutions, though simple, represent a deep understanding of their environment and the tools they had. Straw, fire, shared warmth, and patient endurance. These were not comforts. These were necessities. But there's something missing from this picture, a detail that made all the difference, especially for the people not lucky enough to dine near the hearth or sleep under a feathered canopy. What about the servants? The ones who made this fragile warmth possible, how did they survive the frozen nights of a stone castle? Now that you've settled into the rhythm of castle life, imagine stepping not into the chambers of nobility, but into the frigid, dark quarters of the servant class. Here, the realities of daily life in the Middle Ages become far more austere, especially when it came to surviving the cold. If the Great Hall was the glowing heart of the castle, then the servant spaces were its barely beating extremities. Hidden in narrow corridors, tucked behind kitchens, and shoved beneath stairwells, the servant's realm was colder, darker, and far less forgiving. The hierarchy of warmth. Warmth in a medieval castle followed a strict social gradient. Those at the top, nobles, lords, high-ranking guests, enjoyed proximity to fires, thicker bedding, and private chambers. The further down the ladder you went, the less comfort you were granted. Servants, no matter their role, were expected to perform their duties regardless of season or temperature. Whether in the depths of winter or the damp of autumn, they fetched water from frozen wells, chopped wood in the courtyard, and lit fires long before anyone else rose from their beds. But these fires were not for themselves. Even the highest-ranking servants, chamberlains, stewards, lived in colder, shared rooms, often sleeping on rush-strewn floors, curled into cloaks or woolen wraps. Lower servants, kitchen hands, grooms, washerwomen often slept in work areas or open halls, huddled together for warmth with nothing but coarse blankets and each other's body heat. The kitchen fires, warmth with a price. If there was one place in the castle where a servant might occasionally feel warm, it was the kitchen. With its great oven and roaring fire pits, The kitchen was alive with heat, but also with intense labor. Boiling cauldrons, roasting spits, and burning logs required constant attention. Kitchens were smoky, slippery, and crowded with laborers who rarely had time to enjoy the warmth they generated. During winter feasts, the kitchen's fires might burn day and night. Even so, servants rarely lingered. Warmth came with proximity to fire and burns. Blistered hands and smoke-choked lungs were the trade-offs for moments of fleeting comfort. Even in the kitchen, warmth could be deceptive. The fire heated the air only directly around it. Stone walls and open chimneys meant that cold winds could still snake through. And when the work was done, servants were often ordered out, forced back into their cold dormitories, trailing smoke in their hair and frost on their boots. Cloaks, layers, and sleep. Without the luxury of feather beds, servants slept in thick wool garments, sometimes fully dressed for the next day's work. Linen shifts, woolen tunics, hose, and cloaks were layered to trap whatever warmth the body could generate. Most could not afford fur, but sheepskin or patched wool capes were common. These were rarely laundered. Heat retention mattered more than cleanliness. Nightcaps and mittens were worn to bed. Feet were wrapped in spare cloth or placed near gently heated stones. And still, sleep was often shallow and disrupted by the cold. The straw or rushes on the floors of servant quarters were sometimes mixed with hay or old cloth, but they didn't offer much insulation. Rodents were common. So were insects. Sleeping close to the fire was desirable but risky. Even a single overturned ember could spell disaster, and many castles suffered fatal fires from unattended warming pans or fallen candles. Early risers, frozen fingers. Before the first cockcrow, servants were awake. The castle's fires needed stoking. Coals needed carrying. Beds had to be warmed for noble occupants. Often, this meant servants had to enter their masters' chambers still half asleep, sometimes barefoot, to relight fires or roll warming pans between the linens. Firewood was precious, and it was usually locked away in storehouses overseen by the castle's steward. Servants who mishandled firewood or used it for personal comfort could face harsh punishment. Some tasks were particularly brutal in winter. Drawing water from frozen cisterns or wells required smashing through surface ice. Laundering linens meant kneeling by freezing streams. The work was physical and constant, and though it did generate some internal warmth, the cold always returned during moments of stillness. Shared beds and silent suffering. To combat the cold, servants often slept several to a bed or on long wooden benches, shoulder to shoulder. This was not a social custom, it was a survival tactic. Heat shared was heat preserved. Blankets, when available, were coarse and thin. Most simply used whatever clothing they had. There are accounts of entire servant households sleeping in long dormitories, with bodies arranged like firewood, stacked, positioned, and rotated to reduce exposure. But there were no roaring hearths here. At best, a single brazier might glow in the middle of the room, fed with the dregs of the day's firewood. Servants were also expected to be silent, even in their suffering. Complaining of the cold could be seen as impertinence. They were taught to endure, to see suffering as part of their station, or even as a virtue. Warmth, like comfort, was for their betters. Children and the cold. Castle children, whether wards, squires, or pages, faced a mixed experience. Noble-born children were given better beds and warmer quarters, often sharing rooms with tutors or nurses. But the children of servants grew up hard. They worked from a young age, helping in kitchens or stables, sleeping on shared pallets. Their clothing was frequently hand-me-downs, worn wool, patched hose. They learned quickly not to complain. If they were lucky, they might serve as a companion to a noble child and spend time in warmer rooms. But for most, winter was just a cold that never ended. The castle as a living body. Understanding medieval castles means seeing them less like palaces and more like living bodies. The hearths were the hearts, the kitchens, the lungs. The thick walls were skin, and the drafty corridors were the cold extremities. Warmth gathered in the center and dissipated at the edges. And like any body, the warmth was prioritized, preserved for the vital organs, the lords, the ladies, the guests. The servants, useful but expendable, lived in the periphery. Cold hands, cold beds, cold lives. Despite all this, they endured. For generation after generation, servants kept the fires burning for others. They did not write their stories, but they are etched into the worn flagstones, the scorched hearth edges, and the soot-darkened beams. But one more element of warmth and survival remains to be discussed. What about the role of architecture? Could the design of the castle itself make life warmer or colder for everyone inside? Step back now and look at the castle as a whole. The towering stone walls, narrow windows, winding staircases, and lofty keeps, all of it served a purpose. Defense, above all else, guided the design of medieval castles. But beneath that martial intent, there were quiet architectural attempts, subtle, calculated, and sometimes accidental, that influenced how warmth could be preserved or lost. This final section explores how architecture itself became a silent ally, or a stubborn enemy in the battle against cold. Thickness as insulation. At first glance, the thick stone walls of medieval castles seem cold and unfeeling, and they were. But their mass served more than a military function. Though slow to warm, stone held onto heat longer than lighter materials once warmed. This thermal inertia meant that if the interior of a room could be heated even modestly, it would retain that warmth better than a timber structure might. Certain rooms were built with this in mind. For example, lower chambers, partially buried in the earth, benefited from geothermal insulation. The soil maintained a relatively stable temperature year-round, making some basements warmer in winter than upper chambers buffeted by icy winds. In wealthier castles, walls could be up to 10 feet thick at their base. This density, though hard to heat, buffered the interior from rapid temperature swings. In a sense, castles were designed to resist change, whether in politics, warfare, or weather. The solar, a pocket of privilege. One of the most deliberate architectural choices for comfort was the solar, a private, upper-floor room, usually located on the south side of a castle. The solar was often the warmest room in the entire structure, and it was reserved for the lord's family. Positioned for maximum sunlight during the day, it often had its own fireplace, thick curtains, and glazed windows if the owner could afford them. The name solar itself hints at its purpose, a place where sunlight and thus warmth was prioritized. Glazed windows were a rarity in medieval Europe until the later Middle Ages, and even then they were expensive and reserved for the elite. Most windows were simply openings covered with oiled cloth, wooden shutters, or translucent animal horn. The solar might have the luxury of actual glass, helping to trap warm air inside. This room was often raised above the damp ground floor, away from drafts, and near the main chimney, ensuring that warmth from below drifted upward. In a cold world, the solar was a strategic architectural comfort positioned to catch warmth from nature and retain it. Window openings and wind management. It's easy to underestimate the role of windows in controlling interior temperature. Medieval castle windows were famously narrow and recessed. These arrow slits, or loopholes, were designed primarily for defense, but their shape had thermal advantages too. Narrow windows limited drafts while allowing light and controlled airflow. On bitter nights, internal wooden shutters could be drawn and secured. Some wealthier households lined their shutters with cloth or leather to help trap warmth. In more sophisticated designs, double shutters were used, one on the inside, one on the outside, creating an early form of insulated glazing. Rooms with multiple openings often had tapestries hung on the walls, not just as decoration, but as insulation. Thick wool or linen wall hangings trapped a layer of air between the stone and the fabric, acting as primitive thermal blankets for the structure itself. Room placement and heat zones. The layout of medieval castles reflected an awareness of heat flow, even if it wasn't articulated in modern thermodynamic terms. Kitchens were often located on the south or southeast side to catch morning sunlight and to direct cooking heat away from sleeping areas. Proximity to kitchens became a factor in comfort rooms closer to heat sources were warmer. Upper floors were almost always warmer than lower ones, not just from rising heat, but from increased exposure to sun. Noble families slept upstairs when possible, while storage or servant quarters were relegated to lower or more peripheral zones. Even staircases, winding, narrow, and spiraled, helped reduce airflow, functioning as barriers to wind movement through the structure. They were intentional choke points for defense and for warmth. Chimneys and the rise of the flue. One of the most significant architectural advancements in heating came during the 12th and 13th centuries, the chimney. Before this, most fires vented smoke through holes in the roof or central smoke hoods. It worked after a fashion, but much heat escaped along with the smoke. The invention of the chimney flue allowed for better air draw and more localized heating. Rooms could now have their own small fireplaces without filling with smoke. This shifted how castles were built. Chimneys became structural features. Rooms began to cluster around vertical heat columns. Even multi-floor heating became possible as warm air and flue pipes passed through several chambers on their way upward. Not all castles incorporated this change immediately. Chimneys were costly and required careful stonework. But in wealthier households and royal castles, they became standard, transforming the experience of indoor winter life. Flooring and the draft below. Even the floor beneath your feet played a role in temperature. Stone floors were brutally cold in winter, so efforts were made to insulate them, however crudely. Rushes were common, as previously discussed, but in some castles, raised wooden platforms were constructed over the stone to create an air gap. These platforms helped reduce the cold leaching from the ground, and in some advanced cases, were covered in mats, woven rugs, or even fur pelts. Heated floors, known as hypocaust systems, were known in ancient Rome but largely vanished during the medieval period in the West. However, a few rare castles, particularly in areas influenced by Islamic engineering, experimented with underfloor heating systems. The castle as a seasonal organism. Castles were not just built to survive winter. They were seasonal organisms. Summer and winter rooms existed. Furniture was moved. Tapestries were hung in colder months and taken down when temperatures rose. Walls might be whitewashed to reflect summer light or covered with textiles to absorb winter gloom. Occupants moved with the seasons. Great halls were used more in winter, courtyards and balconies in summer. The castle adapted because it had to. It was too expensive and too dangerous to remain uncomfortable for long. Even the architecture of water cisterns, bathhouses, and wells reflected winter realities. Some castles had enclosed water sources to prevent freezing. Bathing itself became a seasonal act, avoided during the coldest months and embraced during warmer seasons. Final reflections. Looking at a medieval castle now, with its romantic towers and crumbling battlements, it's easy to miss the human detail, the quiet, daily war against the cold. But every stone, every wall thickness, every chimney, and every straw-scattered floor tells a story of adaptation. These weren't just buildings. They were machines of survival, and every person inside, from the lord in the solar to the scullion in the cellar, relied on design as much as fire. The architecture of warmth wasn't perfect. Many still froze, many still suffered. But these ancient strategies, simple as they were, allowed life to continue, through frost, through famine, through endless winters without central heat or double-glazed windows. And as the centuries passed, the strategies evolved. But would the arrival of the Renaissance and its new ideas finally make castle life comfortable, or simply more complicated? Story 2. Sleeping with the servants. the overcrowded chambers of medieval nights. Close your eyes and imagine it's just after dusk in a 14th century castle, not in the noble quarters but several levels down, deep within the service quarters. You've finished a long day of hauling firewood, fetching water, tending to animals, or perhaps preparing and serving meals for your betters. You are tired, but the day is not entirely over. It is time to find a space to sleep. But there are no private bedrooms, no personal beds. There is no warm bath waiting, no soft pillow to sink into. What lies ahead is a shared bed, or perhaps just a space on a straw-covered floor nestled shoulder to shoulder with people you may or may not know well. You may be sleeping next to a groom, a scullery maid, or a fellow page in training. There's little conversation. Everyone is cold. Everyone is exhausted. This was the ordinary sleep of the medieval lower classes, a world defined not by silence and solitude, but by crowding, proximity, and a practical disregard for privacy. Sleeping as a communal act. In modern times, sleep is largely seen as a personal, private affair. But for most people in the Middle Ages, it was anything but. For servants, tradespeople, and laborers, sleeping arrangements were communal by default. Castles, monasteries, manors, even urban homes were spaces where beds were scarce and people were many. One mattress, stuffed with straw, wool, or rags, might sleep 2 to 6 people. In winter, more. Beds were valued for warmth, not ownership. They were not personal possessions but shared resources. Who slept where and with whom was dictated by rank, gender, duties, and sometimes luck. Servants of the same sex typically slept in groups. Sometimes 2 men or 2 women might share a bed throughout the year, forming what was called a bedfellow relationship. While today this might carry assumptions, at the time it was ordinary, expected, and devoid of romantic implication. Sharing a bed was about conserving heat and space. The bedfellow relationship. The term bedfellow appears throughout medieval records and literature. Kings had bedfellows, so did squires, even bishops. Bed-sharing was not only accepted, it was a feature of the social fabric. A bedfellow might be a trusted servant, a companion in training, or a person of equal station. This arrangement allowed warmth, but it also provided social bonding. In households where hierarchy was strict, sharing a bed could blur boundaries, but only slightly. A servant never forgot their station, even while sleeping. One might rise first, defer in space, or give the other better covers. Even in rest, order was maintained. It was common for children, especially in rural families, to sleep together in large groups. A single bed might accommodate all siblings. Parents and infants shared beds, too. Privacy, as a concept, simply did not exist the way it does today. Beds as furniture and status. Actual bed frames were expensive. In many servant quarters there were none. People slept on pallets, simple platforms, or piles of straw laid on the floor. If lucky, a servant might sleep on a wooden frame strung with rope or leather webbing, topped with a stuffed mattress. But these were typically reserved for senior household staff. Bedding materials varied widely depending on the region and wealth of the household. Wool, feathers, or even dried leaves could be used for stuffing. Sheets were often coarse linen, changed infrequently. Blankets were made of wool, and bed curtains, when they existed, were prized possessions offering both warmth and a semblance of privacy. Rooms with multiple beds often had no barriers between them. In winter, servants might push beds together, creating one large sleeping area. In particularly cold conditions, animals were sometimes brought indoors not for companionship, but for heat. A dog, goat, or even pig might sleep in the same room or just outside it, sharing its body warmth with human occupants. Night noises and sleep disruption. Imagine the sounds of the servant dormitory: shuffling straw, the muffled coughs of the ill, whispered conversations, the rustle of mice in the rushes, and perhaps the low snoring of exhausted bodies. Sleep was not necessarily peaceful. It was often light, easily disturbed by temperature changes, sudden duties, or even the need to empty chamber pots in the dark. There was little in the way of night clothes. Most slept in the same garments they wore by day, sometimes with outer cloaks added for warmth. Nightcaps, woolen socks, and mittens were common. Some even slept with gloves on. The goal was not comfort, it was conservation. Sleep cycles were different too. In the absence of artificial light, the medieval night was long. People often practiced segmented sleep, a first sleep, followed by a brief period of wakefulness, and then a second sleep. During that middle period, servants might tend fires, pray, talk quietly, or perform short tasks. Then they would return to bed until dawn. Gender and separation, or lack thereof. While noble households sometimes separated the sexes for sleeping, in servant quarters this was not always possible. Labor needs often dictated who was placed where. In overcrowded households, men and women might share the same sleeping room, though rarely the same bed unless married or related. Gender separation was more common in monastic settings or among wealthier employers. But even then, enforcement was lax. There are documented instances of servants, especially young pages or kitchen maids, engaging in quiet romances or secret rendezvous under the cover of darkness. Such events, though frowned upon, were not unexpected. Yet most nights, the exhaustion of physical labor and the biting cold left little room for mischief. Sleep was a necessity. When it came, it was often dreamless and brief. Fire, light, and midnight tasks. Servant quarters rarely had their own hearths. If there was any warmth, it came from a distant kitchen fire or a brazier that had long since cooled. The only light came from tallow candles or rushlights, cheap, smoky, and short-lived. But even sleep brought no guarantee of rest. Servants could be summoned at any time, especially if noble residents woke cold or hungry. Chambermaids were expected to rise and light fires, fetch water, or bring warmed stones for their master's feet. Pages might be dispatched to find dropped cloaks or adjust window shutters. These interruptions were taken for granted. They were not resented, they were simply part of the rhythm of life. In many ways, the medieval servant's night was a continuation of the day. Work, rest, work again. The lingering cold. Even beneath blankets and beside companions, the cold was ever present. In winter, frost formed on walls. Breath rose in visible clouds. Fingers and toes numbed. Beds were damp. Airflow was poor. Illnesses were common: coughs, chills, fevers, all exacerbated by the shared air in close quarters. Yet people endured. Generations of servants lived, loved, aged, and died in these shared rooms. They built bonds and networks that span lifetimes. The warmth they found was in each other, not in fireplaces or furnishings. But how did the nobility sleep, in contrast? Did privacy and luxury shield them from the nightly discomfort? Or did even the lords and ladies feel the bite of medieval night? Imagine now, instead of bedding down on a straw mat with 5 others, you are ushered up a winding stone staircase, past torchlit tapestries, into a noble's chamber. Heavy wooden doors close behind you. The walls are hung with faded wool tapestries. A fire glows faintly in the hearth. This is the lord's sleeping chamber. But it is not warm. Not really. Though the room is grander, though the bed is a carved oak frame draped in curtains and piled with wool and feather, the air still bites. Cold seeps through the stone. The fire has been burning for hours, but most of the heat has escaped up the flue. You step closer to the bed and feel the sheets still faintly warm from the warming pan the chambermaid passed through minutes ago. This was noble sleep in the medieval world. It may have appeared more luxurious, but in many ways it was still a nightly endurance. Beds as thrones of sleep. To understand the noble sleeping experience, it's important to grasp how symbolic and functional the bed truly was. A noble's bed was a central piece of furniture, monumental, carved, and often transported between residences. It was not just a place to sleep, but a site of authority. In many noble households, The bed was placed on a raised platform or dais within the solar or a private chamber. Heavy drapes enclosed it on all sides. These bed curtains were not merely decorative, they served to trap heat, reduce drafts, and offer a semblance of privacy even in semi-public rooms. In wealthier castles, a lord and lady might have their own private sleeping rooms. In smaller households, they often shared a chamber. However, unlike the servant classes, the nobility were more likely to sleep alone in the bed even if their spouse was nearby. Shared warmth was useful, but privacy and dignity were emphasized. Fireplaces and warming devices. Noble chambers typically had their own fireplaces, although these were often small and inefficient by modern standards. Firewood had to be conserved, even by the rich, and fireplaces were typically lit only in the late afternoon or evening. Servants, usually female chambermaids, were tasked with lighting, maintaining, and later extinguishing the fire. It was not uncommon for the chamber fire to be allowed to die out overnight. The risk of a stray ember setting fire to the bed curtains or floor rushes was too great. Instead, warming pans filled with embers were used to heat the bed before entry. These brass or copper pans were passed between the sheets to warm them carefully, as the risk of scorching was real. Stones, heated by fire and wrapped in cloth, were also used. Some households employed small, portable braziers for mild overnight warmth, although these too posed a risk of smoke inhalation or fire. Wealthier castles had chimneys to help ventilate these fires, but chimneys were rare until the 14th century and not widespread until later. Clothing in bed. Nobles, despite their rank, dressed for bed similarly to everyone else, layered and with an emphasis on practicality. Men wore long linen or woolen nightshirts, sometimes with hose or stockings. Women might wear shifts, with woolen cloaks or caps for added warmth. Nightcaps, long associated with sleep, helped retain heat and protect the ears from drafts. Sleepwear was not frequently washed. Linen could be cleaned more often than wool, but most bedding was expensive and labor-intensive to launder. Bedsheets were aired out during the day, occasionally sprinkled with herbs or perfumed waters to mask odors. Rituals of the bedchamber. The bedchamber was a site of ceremony as well as rest. It was where private audiences occurred, where favored courtiers were invited, and where nobles received intimate news. In royal courts, bedchambers were political spaces. Access was strictly controlled. Who stood beside the bed, who helped undress the monarch, and who lit the evening fire all carried significance. Before retiring, nobles might drink warmed wine, read religious texts, or receive briefings from trusted stewards. Afterward, attendants often of the same sex helped remove outer garments, brush out hair, and prepare the bed. Once inside, the curtains were drawn, and the world shut away. For noblewomen, sleep came after a similar set of rituals. Ladies-in-waiting helped with undressing, hair braiding, and prayers. If the woman was married and conjugal duties were expected, the bedchamber became a shared space with her husband. Otherwise, she often slept alone, attended only by her maid. Solitude and sleep. Though servants slept in crowded conditions, nobles often slept in solitude, and that, paradoxically, could be a colder, lonelier experience. A single person in a large bed, in a tall, drafty chamber, with the fire gone out and only a woolen cloak for company, this was sleep in the high tower. Some nobles kept dogs in their chambers not only for companionship, but also for warmth. Lapdogs, small enough to sleep under the covers, were particularly favored. Cats, too, were sometimes welcomed bedfellows, though their presence was more tolerated than invited. Despite wealth, noble sleep could be restless. The same segmented sleep common among peasants was also practiced by the elite. Midnight prayers, trips to the privy, or moments of quiet reflection filled the waking gap between first and second sleep. Cold privilege. Even in a well-furnished room, the cold permeated. Tapestries on the walls helped buffer the chill, and floor rushes were changed more frequently than in servant quarters. But stone was still stone. Wind found its way in through cracks. Ice sometimes formed on interior walls. Bedwarmers dulled the edge but never erased the chill. Still, the nobility slept with layers of protection: fabric, fire, furniture, and servants, all acting as buffers between them and the harsh medieval climate. Their comfort was real, but it was not complete. They too awoke to cold noses and frozen water pitchers. They too listened to the wind batter the tower walls and prayed for the sun's return. Yet within their sleep lay a degree of distance from labor, from overcrowding, and from the shared burdens of the lower classes. But the gap between noble and peasant wasn't just about the cold, it was about space. And nothing illustrates that better than the architecture of medieval sleeping arrangements. What can the layout of these sleeping spaces, grand chambers, narrow servant dormitories, and multifunctional halls reveal about the nature of medieval society itself? Imagine pulling back from the fire-warmed bedchambers of lords and the packed straw pallets of scullions. Zoom out far enough, and a medieval castle or even a large manor begins to take on a different form. It becomes not just a place of stone and status, but a map of sleep itself: who slept where and why. It's in this arrangement of space, this built geography of rest, that the most telling insights emerge, not only about comfort, but about hierarchy, survival, and the very shape of medieval society. The Great Hall, where status and sleep met. In many early medieval castles and manor houses, the Great Hall served as the central room for everything: meals, entertainment, ceremony, and sleep. During the day, the hall bustled with activity, alive with voices and footsteps. But at night, it changed character. Servants, squires, and even some members of the extended household would spread out on the floor to sleep, surrounded by the fatting warmth of the central hearth. Straw and rushes were spread across the floor to muffle the cold and damp. Blankets, cloaks, and shared beds were unrolled. The same room that had echoed with music and speech hours earlier now filled with snores and whispered prayers. This dual function reflected a society in which space was precious and always political. Even in sleep, placement mattered. Those closer to the fire or nearer the high table had greater privilege, just as they did during meals. Proximity to warmth reflected proximity to power. The lord and lady, they slept not in the hall but above it. The chamber above the hall. The private sleeping quarters of nobility were usually located one floor above the Great Hall. This wasn't just for privacy, it was for heat. Warm air from the hearth below would rise and provide modest comfort to the rooms above. These chambers were often called the upper chamber, or simply the chamber, because they were one of the few truly private indoor spaces in medieval homes. The Lord's chamber was sometimes connected to or located near the solar, which, as discussed earlier, was the warmest and most comfortable room in the house, oriented to catch sunlight and shielded from northern winds. Beds in these chambers were often large, curtained, and raised from the floor. In some wealthy households, bedchambers had antechambers or adjoining rooms for attendants to sleep in. But this separation of space, this architectural layering, reflected more than just warmth or convenience. It was a map of status. The higher you slept, both literally and figuratively, the higher you stood in society. Servants in the shadows. Not all castles had purpose-built dormitories for servants. In many, sleeping spaces for the lower classes were makeshift and flexible. The scullery maid might sleep near the hearth in the kitchen, the stable boy in a loft above the animals, the steward in a closet-sized room near the solar. Pages and squires in training were sometimes allowed to sleep just outside their master's chamber in hallways, or in the wardrobe room, ready to assist at a moment's notice. The tight, repurposed sleeping spaces of the working class were often little more than corners or cupboards. Attics, cellars, and closets became places to sleep not because they were warm, but because they were out of the way. Some castles, particularly larger and more organized ones, eventually developed true servant dormitories, long rooms filled with low beds or pallets. But even these rarely had fireplaces or insulation. They were places to endure the night, not to rest in comfort. And in some households, the architectural separation between noble and servant quarters was enforced not just by distance, but by locked doors. Monastic sleeping, the rule of order. In monasteries and abbeys, sleep was governed by a different force discipline. Monastic dormitories, often called dormitoria, were communal but tightly structured. Monks or nuns slept in rows, often in small alcoves or curtained cubicles. Their days were rigidly scheduled, and so were their nights. The midnight prayer, matins, meant rising in the cold dark, often without complaint, and returning to bed for only a few hours before sunrise. Beds were simple, wood-framed with straw mattresses, thin blankets, and woolen sheets. Silence was enforced. Sleep was not an indulgence but a necessity to prepare for prayer. And even in the coldest seasons, monks often slept without fires as an act of discipline. Here, the architecture of sleep reflected spiritual status. The abbot or prior might have a small private cell, but the rest slept together, equally, regardless of age or education. The spiritual hierarchy existed, but the sleeping arrangements embodied a kind of enforced humility. Urban houses and sleeping over shops. Not all sleep happened in castles or monasteries. In towns and cities, the medieval working class often lived in narrow, multi-level homes. A shopkeeper might run a business downstairs and sleep with their family in a loft above. These rooms were small and unheated, with thatched or timber roofs that leaked cold air in winter and heat in summer. Beds were shared by the entire family. Parents slept with children. Apprentices might sleep in the same room or on benches in the shop. Privacy was nearly non-existent. Still, there was a practicality to the design. Warmth from cooking fires rose into sleeping areas above. Floors were packed earth, sometimes covered in straw or reeds. In winter, families sometimes brought livestock inside for warmth and security. These homes, like castles, were designed not for comfort but for continuity. They were lived-in spaces where day and night, work and rest, blurred together. Boundaries and transitions. The sleeping spaces of the Middle Ages tell us much about the society that built them. They reflect values that seem foreign now: communalism, endurance, hierarchy, and an intimate relationship between architecture and survival. Today, we separate living from sleeping, work from rest. We seek privacy, silence, and climate control. But in the Middle Ages, sleeping was as social as waking. It was shaped by obligation, religion, class, and design. Space wasn't just about shelter, it was about signaling who mattered, who was trusted, and who was allowed to be comfortable. In that way, even while sleeping, the medieval world remained wide awake with meaning. But what happened when everything broke down? When a household moved? When the castle was under siege or the town caught fire? How did people sleep in times of crisis? And what role did emergency sleeping arrangements play in the story of survival? Story 3: Charity and Comfort in Monastic Sleep. It is a quiet evening in a small monastic hospital in the English countryside. The year is 1386. Outside, a faint mist clings to the late autumn air. Inside, a single candle burns near a narrow wooden bed. A man, old, weathered, wrapped in a patched woolen blanket, whispers a prayer before sleep. He is not a monk. He is a bedesman, a poor, elderly layman who has been taken in by the monastery. His duty is simple, he prays, not for himself but for the souls of those who gave him shelter. In return, he receives food, a blanket, a bed, and something few in his station ever had: a place to sleep in relative peace. The bedesman was a fixture of medieval charity. In a world without social welfare or pensions, his existence depended on the grace of the Church and the enduring belief that prayers of the humble had real spiritual power. Who was the bedesman? The word bedesman, also spelled beadsman or beadman, derives from the Old English word bed, meaning prayer. A bedesman was literally a man of prayer, a poor soul supported by a religious institution or a wealthy patron in exchange for his daily prayers, or bead, often said for the benefactor's departed family members. He was, in essence, a professional prayer. In a society where salvation was a central concern, and where masses for the dead were viewed as essential, the prayers of a humble bedesman were believed to carry weight, especially when said consistently and faithfully. Bedesmen were usually elderly, infirm, or impoverished men who had no means to support themselves. They were not monks. They didn't take vows, but they lived near or within monastic communities and followed simple devotional routines. They were often allowed to stay in almshouses, simple lodgings established by the church or wealthy individuals to house the poor. In larger monasteries, bedesmen sometimes had small dormitories or annexes set aside for them. The gift of sleep. What made the bedesman's role unique was not only his access to regular food and shelter, but the dignity of stable sleep. In a medieval world where the poor often slept in barns, hedgerows, or overcrowded households, the bedesman's simple bed was a small mercy. Almshouses offered shared sleeping quarters, sometimes with individual beds, sometimes with long wooden benches. Straw mattresses were common, stuffed with hay or coarse wool. Bedding might include a single woolen blanket and a linen sheet, changed only a few times a year. Despite the austerity, this was considered a luxury among the poor. The bedesman had a roof over his head. He was not forced to beg in the cold or compete for space in a barn. In winter, the bed might be placed near a brazier or fireplace if the house could afford one. Monastic records occasionally show expenses for heating the bedesman's dormitory or replacing their blankets. Such care, though modest, reflected a deeply embedded cultural value. That charity toward the poor was not only righteous, but necessary for the soul. A life of routine. The daily life of a bedesman followed a monastic rhythm, though less rigidly than for monks. He was expected to attend morning mass, say prayers at designated hours, and keep a respectful demeanor. In return, he received meals, access to a latrine, and the right to sleep indoors. Most bedesmen were silent during meals and sleep, in accordance with monastic expectations. Quiet was part of the discipline, and many embraced it. Others, particularly those housed in more urban hospitals or secular almshouses, had more relaxed routines. A common feature of bedesman life was the bead roll, a written list of names, often kept by a monk or clerk, which the bedesman was expected to pray through. These names included both the living and the dead, benefactors and family members, often stretching back generations. Praying for the dead wasn't only an obligation, it was a spiritual lifeline. In a culture where purgatory loomed large, the prayers of the living were believed to shorten the suffering of souls awaiting redemption. The bedesman's quiet voice, murmuring by candlelight, was part of this great cosmic exchange. Spaces of sleep, almshouses and hospitals. Almshouses varied greatly in size and design. Some were attached to monasteries. Others stood alone, funded by a guild or noble family. Most housed between 4 and 12 men, with rare institutions offering space for women as well. Sleeping quarters were usually simple long rooms, sometimes with partitions for privacy. Floors were stone or packed earth. Beds were lined up in rows, with small wooden chests at the foot of each for personal belongings. Ventilation was poor. Windows were small and unglazed, but in many cases, these were the best conditions the poor could hope for. Some almshouses even offered candles at night or assigned a firekeeper to tend to a central hearth. These were rare comforts in a harsh world, and while conditions varied by region and wealth, the idea remained consistent. The bedesman had been given the gift of rest, not as a right, but as a reward for prayer. A model of charity. The Bedesmen embodied a medieval theology of mutual obligation. The rich gave alms to the poor gave prayers to the rich. In doing so, both were spiritually enriched. This model was not always benevolent. Bedesmen were sometimes viewed as burdens or treated dismissively. They could be expelled for disobedience, for drunkenness, or for being useless in their prayer. Yet many institutions took their care seriously, providing clothing, basic medical treatment, and even burial. Monasteries that supported Bedesmen often recorded their names, the dates they entered, and occasionally when they died. Some were buried in graveyards beside the monks, an acknowledgement of their long, prayerful service. But what happened in times of scarcity, when the monastery itself could no longer afford to feed or house the Bedesmen? What became of these quiet servants of prayer when charity ran dry? Picture a monastery in the early 15th century, its stone walls darkened by age and smoke. Inside, routines carry on, bells ring, prayers echo, ink scratches parchment. But something is different. The kitchen fires are smaller, the loaves of bread are thinner, the gruel more watery, and at the far end of the corridor in the Bedesmen's room, 2 beds now sleep 3. The monastery is struggling. Famine has touched the surrounding countryside. The harvest was poor again. Donations from local lords have dwindled. A war somewhere else has disrupted the trade of grain. Or perhaps the Black Death has passed through again, taking donors, monks, and fellow Bedesmen alike. In times of hardship, the first to feel the cold draft of change were not always the monks, but those living on the edge of charity, the Bedesmen. The fragility of charity. Unlike monks, Bedesmen were not members of the religious order. Their position was conditional, dependent on resources and the continued goodwill of their hosts. When resources tightened, even established Bedesmen could find themselves turned away. There are recorded cases where entire almshouses were shuttered during times of scarcity. In some regions, monastic houses reduced their number of supported poor from dozens to a handful. Bedesmen who had lived for years within the safety of monastic walls found themselves once again exposed to the brutal unpredictability of the outside world. In some places, arrangements were made. Local townspeople might offer food or shelter. Parish churches occasionally stepped in. But more often than not, the quiet dissolution of charitable support left men hungry and cold, forced to beg in marketplaces or sleep in church porches. For the Bedesmen, whose existence was built on the steady exchange of prayers for bread, the collapse of that contract could be devastating. Prayers as currency. In more stable times, a Bedesman's prayers were a form of currency. The more he prayed, the more valuable he was seen to be. Some monasteries increased expectations during hard seasons, adding more names to the bedroll, assigning additional masses or psalms. The belief was sincere. More prayers could help more souls and possibly encourage more alms. It was a spiritual economy, and the Bedesman was both participant and product. But when donations stopped, when patrons died, fled, or redirected their wealth elsewhere, the prayers, no matter how devout, could not fill empty pantries. Some monasteries responded with innovation. They allowed Bedesmen to assist with light duties, sweeping cloisters, tending gardens, or aiding the infirm in exchange for continued support. Others organized communal prayer events to remind the local gentry of their spiritual obligations. Still, these efforts did not always succeed. Sleeping through hard times. As food supplies dwindled, warmth became even more essential. Monasteries, always careful with fuel, now rationed firewood to the hour. Braziers might be lit only in the evening. Blankets were patched rather than replaced. Beds that once slept one now slept two. Some Bedesmen died quietly during these seasons of hardship. Their names recorded in margin notes. John Bedesman died in the frost, buried with prayer. Others left voluntarily, seeking warmer or more generous houses elsewhere. And yet, not all was lost. In some corners of Europe, these very challenges led to reforms in the practice of charity. Guilds and wealthy merchants began to fund chantries, small chapels, or prayer groups focused on the same mission of intercessory prayer, often with better support systems. The role of the bedesman began to shift from a humble figure housed by monks to a more organized component of civic religious life. Bedesmen beyond the monastery. By the late 15th century, many towns had their own almshouses independent of monasteries. These were funded by local guilds, city councils, or wealthy families wishing to provide for their communities, while also ensuring prayers for their own souls. In these urban almshouses, the role of the bedesman persisted, but the setting changed. He might now live in a small, single-room dwelling with his own hearth and bed. He still prayed, but his life was more integrated into the secular world. The monastic model was not forgotten, however. Many urban almshouses kept to the same rhythms of devotion. The rules were often drawn directly from earlier Benedictine or Augustinian traditions. Silence, order, and evening prayers remained core elements of daily life. But the experience of sleep changed. Where once 6 bedesmen had shared a single room, now each might have a small private cell. Where fires were once rare, hearths now warmed each unit. And while bedding remained simple, the dignity of personal space was a marked evolution. Still, even with these improvements, the threat of instability loomed. Fires, disease, and war continued to disrupt lives. Bedesmen, like all the poor, lived close to the edge. Their security, no matter how well structured, was always provisional. Reflections in the records. The written records of bedesmen are sparse but poignant. Lists of names, dates of admission, brief notes of illness or death. Occasionally, a thank you letter from a grateful soul. Rarely, a poem or psalm copied in a shaky hand. These fragments speak to lives lived quietly, with devotion and endurance. Sleep, for the bedesman, was both rest and reward, a warmth earned through prayer. Some records note special efforts made for the dying bedesman. An extra blanket, a vigil kept, a burial with candle and cross. These moments of grace remind us that in a harsh world, even small kindnesses could shine brightly. But what happened as the Reformation swept across Europe? When monasteries were dissolved and their properties seized, what became of the bedesmen then? When charity became suspect and monasteries fell, did the bedesman's blanket unravel completely or find new threads in a changing world? The year is 1540. The air is thick with change. Across England, the monasteries are falling silent. Bells that once rang out at dawn for matins now toll for the last time. Their lands are confiscated, their chapels shuttered, their monks scattered. In the ruins of these great religious houses, once firm centers of charity, a quiet figure lingers, the bedesman. He is old. His prayers still echo from his lips, but no one records them now. The bead rolls have been burned. The beds in the dormitory are empty, and the small brazier that once warmed the narrow sleeping room has long since gone cold. In the sweeping religious and political changes of the 16th century, it was not only the monks and abbots who suffered. The humble bedesman, too long a symbol of pious endurance and quiet reciprocity, faced a sudden and quiet disappearance. The dissolution of the monasteries. Between 1536 and 1541, under the rule of Henry VIII, hundreds of monasteries, abbeys, and priories across England and Wales were closed or destroyed in the event now known as the dissolution of the monasteries. The motivations were varied: religious reform, political control, and critically, the desire for wealth. Monastic institutions were among the richest landholders in the country, and by closing them, the crown gained access to vast estates, gold, and goods. But along with the wealth went the functions the monasteries had long provided: education, healthcare, refuge for travelers, and most poignantly, charity. thousands of people who had relied on monastic charity were suddenly cast adrift. Among them, countless Bedesmen. The sudden loss of shelter. Many Bedesmen lived in hospital houses attached to monasteries. These institutions were not hospitals in the modern sense, but rather places of shelter, basic care, and sleep. With their closure, the occupants were given no alternative. In many cases, they were simply evicted. Some were elderly, others were infirm. Their services, prayers for the dead, were now viewed as part of a superstitious past. In the new Protestant theology taking hold, the idea of purgatory and intercessory prayer was increasingly rejected. A Bedesman's role, once considered spiritually vital, was now deemed obsolete or worse, heretical. Few records exist detailing their fates. Some may have been taken in by sympathetic households. Others disappeared into the growing numbers of poor wandering the countryside. For many, the end of monastic support was the end of dependable sleep. A shifting theology of sleep and charity. With the Reformation came a profound shift in how charity was understood. In Protestant regions, charity began to be framed more as a moral responsibility of the individual citizen, rather than a spiritual transaction mediated by the church. Almsgiving did not vanish, but it changed in tone. It became more about social order than salvation. Municipal authorities began to create poor laws to regulate begging, vagrancy, and housing. While some institutions continued to support the aged and infirm, they were often strict, secular, and focused on labor as a condition of aid. The concept of the Bedesman, as one who gave prayers in exchange for rest, no longer fit. Yet some traces of the tradition remained. Survival in the shadows, secular almshouses. Though the monasteries fell, not all support structures disappeared. In towns and cities across England and parts of Europe, secular almshouses continued to operate. Many were founded by wealthy individuals or guilds, concerned not only with social duty but with legacy. These almshouses were more regulated than their monastic predecessors. Residents, still often called Bedesmen, were now subject to civic rules. They were expected to live quietly, attend services at the local parish church, and in some cases wear a uniform or badge marking their position. The life was still humble. Sleeping arrangements remained simple. A small wooden bed, a coarse woolen blanket, and a narrow hearth might be all a man owned. But there was, at least, some measure of shelter. In Scotland, the practice persisted even longer. The blue-gowned Bedesmen, supported by royal patronage, remained into the 18th century. They wore distinctive garments, carried a token of their status, and continued to offer prayers for the monarchy. These later Bedesmen were more symbolic than spiritual. Their prayers became ceremonial, their blankets more honorary than essential. But they carried a thread of continuity from the ancient practice of medieval sleep and sacred obligation. Memory in the margins. By the 17th century, the word Bedesman had begun to fade from common use, but the idea lingered. In literature, Bedesmen were remembered as pious, harmless figures, symbols of a vanished time. In churchyards and old almshouse walls, the traces remain: carved names, brass plaques, half-erased entries in dusty ledgers. We remember kings and abbots, wars and treaties, but the story of the Bedesman is quieter. It is the story of someone who survived by prayer, who slept in the warmth of charity, and who weathered the cold centuries with dignity and silence. He asked for little, just a place to sleep, a bit of bread, a blanket. And for that, he offered his voice to the memory of others. The legacy of the Bedesman. Today, the institutions that housed Bedesmen are mostly gone: ruined cloisters, repurposed buildings, or converted museums. But the idea that society should make space for the vulnerable, that rest should be granted to those who serve in quiet ways indoors. The concept of shelter in exchange for small acts of care, whether prayer, labor, or community participation, continues in modern hostels, senior homes, and social housing projects. And the image of the bedesman cloaked in wool, hands folded in devotion, eyes closed in humble sleep reminds us that the smallest comforts, like warmth and rest, have always been sacred. But the Reformation was not the only great disruption. Elsewhere in the medieval world, winter storms, siege warfare, and rural poverty created yet more challenges. In the next story, we return to the structure itself, the castle, and explore how something as simple as a window slit could mean the difference between freezing or surviving the night. Story 4. The Architecture of Cold Resistance. It is early morning in a windswept castle perched on a coastal cliff in northern England. The sea mist is thick, and the winter air is biting. You walk through a narrow corridor, boots scraping over cold flagstones, and feel a sudden gust. Not through a door, not from a forgotten window left ajar, but from the walls themselves. The draft seeps in through what looks like a crack in the stone, an arrow slit, thin and deliberate. A defensive marvel, yes, but also an unrelenting source of cold. This is the paradox of medieval architecture, built to keep enemies out, yet often unable to keep the cold at bay. In this story, we focus on one of the most underappreciated aspects of medieval design: the windows. Not grand, stained glass cathedral windows, but the humble, practical, strategically placed slits and openings that defined warmth and discomfort in daily castle life. Form follows function, the purpose of arrow slits. First, consider what a window was for in a castle. Unlike modern homes, where windows bring light and views, medieval castle windows had entirely different priorities: defense first, comfort second. Arrow slits, or loopholes, were tall, narrow vertical openings, often less than a hand's width across on the outside. They widened significantly on the inside, forming a cone shape. This allowed archers to move freely while aiming, yet remained difficult for invaders to shoot through. In military terms, they were brilliant. In thermal terms, disastrous. Even the smallest opening in a stone wall became a point of vulnerability against the wind. And these weren't few. Defensive towers and curtain walls were studded with arrow slits, many never fully sealed against weather. Stone conducts cold. Air, unchecked, moves freely. And the combination of the two in a medieval fortress could turn a comfortable chamber into a drafty, bone-cold space, even with a fire roaring in the hearth. Light without heat, the medieval dilemma. Despite their role in defense, windows were still necessary for basic functions: lighting, airflow, and sometimes religious observance. In kitchens, smoke needed to escape. In chapels, even narrow lancet windows allowed morning light to filter in during prayers. In guard rooms and stairwells, slits gave visibility to movement below. But for the residents, especially in private chambers, windows were a compromise. Let in a little light but risk the cold. Keep it fully closed and live in perpetual gloom. Glazed windows were rare and expensive, typically reserved for monasteries, cathedrals, and the homes of the very wealthy. Even when they were installed, early glass was thick, bubbly, and poorly insulated. It diffused light but did little to block wind. Instead, windows in most rooms were shuttered, covered with wooden panels that could be latched from the inside. In some households, parchment, oiled cloth, or horn sheets were used to let in light while offering a crude buffer against wind. These coverings were not transparent, but translucent, allowing only a dim, filtered glow. In winter, even these shutters were not enough. Drafts as a constant companion. In many rooms, the cold wasn't just a discomfort, it shaped behavior. People avoided sitting near the walls during winter. The interior surface of stone walls remained cold long after sunrise. Moisture condensed and sometimes froze, forming thin frost inside the castle. Tapestries and hangings weren't only for decoration. They served as thermal shields, draped over walls to reduce the chill. Heavy woolen or velvet curtains might be strung across window recesses, tied open by day and let down at dusk to help trap heat. Some castles included interior wooden shutters that closed flush with the stone, double-layered with cloth to limit the incoming air. Even so, the effect was modest. Windows remained the weak point in the thermal envelope of any medieval room. In the Great Hall, where large windows sometimes stretched high above the hearth, the problem multiplied. Heat rose up and out through unsealed frames. Glass, if present, was often held in place by lead cames, which warped and shrank in the cold, allowing further drafts. Winter was always felt first near a window. Strategic placement of openings. Architects of the Middle Ages were not ignorant of these issues. In fact, many castles exhibit careful planning of window orientation and size to balance defense, lighting, and warmth. North-facing windows were minimized or even eliminated in colder regions, while south-facing walls might feature slightly larger openings to capture daylight and modest solar warmth. In some solars, upper chambers designed for warmth and comfort, larger windows with shutters or primitive glazing appeared, placed to catch the afternoon sun. The thickness of the walls also offered an unintended benefit. Deep window recesses meant that cold air entering the slit would travel a longer path to reach the room's interior. Some of these window alcoves were built with angled sills and seats, allowing people to sit in the light during milder weather, though never during the depths of winter. Window placement wasn't just about light or air, it was about intelligence, watching for distant movements, observing approaching visitors, reading weather patterns from the sky. But for all this strategic brilliance, the simple act of standing near a window in January could make one shiver in seconds. The privilege of glazing. By the late medieval period, glazed windows became more common among the wealthy, especially in the homes of high-ranking nobles and bishops. Glass was expensive, often imported, brittle, and difficult to cut, but its presence was a clear marker of status. Glazed windows were rarely large. They were made of small panes, held in wooden or iron casements, and set into stone frames. Because of cost, these windows might be reserved for the solar, chapel, or family chambers, never the servants' dormitory. Some castles installed sliding wooden panels over glass to protect it from storm damage. Others used interior shutters to double insulate at night. The combination of glass and wood offered marginally better protection from drafts, but still fell short of modern standards. It would not be until the post-medieval period that insulated glazing and glass-blowing techniques made windowed rooms even remotely warm. Living with the cold. Medieval inhabitants didn't expect comfort. They adapted. People dressed for indoors the same way they dressed for out, layered, hooded, gloved. Cloaks were worn to bed. Foot wrappings were stuffed into shoes and then stuffed again into straw. Children were swaddled tightly. The very young and very old were kept away from window walls during the worst months. The architecture of cold resistance was not about elimination, but about management. The castle could not be fully sealed, nor did anyone believe it could. Instead, its residents developed habits, customs, and spatial awareness that helped them survive. But despite the discomfort, the cold served a function. It preserved food. It kept bodies indoors, fostering storytelling, communal meals, and shared tasks. It even shaped spirituality. Cold rooms invited reflection, discipline, and prayer. And in some ways, the window slits themselves, though drafty and unpleasant, reminded everyone inside that beyond the wall was a world of danger and beauty. Snow-covered hills, mist on the moor, the outline of a rider in the distance. But how did these design choices vary across regions between the stone castles of Scotland and the timber-framed manors of southern France? Was cold resistance a universal effort, or a local response shaped by geography and culture? Now imagine you are traveling across medieval Europe not as a knight or a noble, but as an architect, quietly studying how stone buildings fight the cold. You begin in northern Scotland, wind-whipped and bleak, and slowly journey southward, through the Welsh valleys, across the green hills of England, into the rain-soaked flatlands of Flanders, and down to the warm, sun-drenched manors of southern France. The walls are still made of stone. The hearth still burns in the hall, but something is different in each region, a shift in how windows are shaped, where they're placed, and how much the cold is resisted or simply endured. In this section, we explore the quiet ingenuity behind medieval architecture, not in grand innovations, but in small, regionally adapted choices that balance defense, comfort, and climate. Scotland battling the wind with mass. Scotland's climate was among the most punishing in medieval Europe. High winds, constant dampness, and long, dark winters demanded a different approach. Castles here often featured extremely thick walls, sometimes up to 12 feet at the base, to block out both invaders and the weather. Fewer windows, and when present, slits were narrower than in southern counterparts. Windowless basements and lower floors, which were easier to keep warm and used for storage or servant quarters. High placement of windows to prevent drafts from sweeping across occupied space. In Scottish tower houses like those found in the Highlands, windows were deliberately minimized. A single narrow slit on each wall provided light but no real view. Shutters were heavy and internal. Rooms were arranged vertically, so heat could rise and concentrate in upper chambers. The cold could not be fully avoided, but it was contained, an approach born of necessity. England and Wales, balancing light and draft. In England and Wales, where winters were harsh but not as extreme as Scotland, there was more experimentation with window design. Here, you would find arrow slits in military areas, but slightly broader windows in domestic wings. Bay windows and oriel windows appearing in 14th–15th century manners, offering more light, but also requiring heavy curtains or shutters. Use of deep recesses in stone walls, with internal seating alcoves, offering limited warmth on sunny days. In many English castles, especially those later adapted for comfort, such as Bodiam Castle or Warwick, builders attempted to marry security with livability. Windows were placed to capture southern sunlight. A handful of upper chambers featured early leaded glass, a luxury that signaled both wealth and attention to comfort. Still, even with these developments, windows remained cold points. Stone mullions, vertical supports in window openings conducted chill, and condensation was common. Tapestries and shuttered alcoves continued to be relied upon well into the Tudor period. Flanders and northern France, innovations in the flatlands. In the damp, low-lying regions of Flanders and northern France, the challenge was not just wind and cold, but moisture. Buildings here often emphasized elevated floors and drainage to prevent moisture from pooling near windows. Bricked window frames to reduce warping and leakage. Early use of removable wooden window panels, hung with leather hinges and stuffed with straw around the edges in winter. In towns and wealthy manors, glazing became more common by the 14th century. Flemish glassworkers were among the most skilled in Europe, and their products were exported widely. Still, even these panes were often only hand-sized and embedded in lead cames, forming decorative but imperfect mosaics that rattled in the wind. To manage heat loss, windows in urban homes were frequently small and placed higher on the wall, just below exposed timber beams. Curtains were not merely drawn across them but nailed or pegged in place during winter to create a semi-permanent seal. Southern France and the Mediterranean, designing for heat, not cold. As you travel further south into Aquitaine or Provence, you find a reversal of the northern logic. Here, the battle is against heat, not cold. Castles and manors in the region responded with larger windows, often with open latticework or permanent stone grills to allow airflow while deterring invaders. roof overhangs to shade interiors from direct sun. Interior shutters, not just for privacy, but to keep the interior cool during the day and trap modest warmth at night. Stone construction remained common, but walls were often thinner than in the north. Light-colored stone helped reflect sunlight. In winter, open fires and thick wall hangings helped maintain warmth, but deep freezes were rare. Interestingly, despite their larger openings, southern buildings suffered fewer drafts not because of better insulation, but because the air outside was more forgiving. Cold was seasonal and mild. The architectural rhythm was dictated by light, air, and season, not by survival. Commonalities across the map. Despite regional adaptations, certain features of window-related cold resistance remained universal throughout Europe. Deep window embrasures. The thickness of stone walls created recessed window niches that helped slow airflow. Internal shutters. Whether of wood, leather, or heavy cloth, these were standard winter defenses against drafts. Curtains and tapestries, hung not just over walls but over windows themselves, creating an extra layer between the inhabitant and the wind. Seasonal habits. Windows were covered or sealed more tightly in late autumn and reopened fully only after Easter or the first thaw. In a world without thermostats or central heating, managing cold required both architecture and ritual. People adjusted their living patterns, shifting closer to hearths, retreating from window alcoves, and spending more time in interior rooms that had fewer external walls. The role of craftsmanship. It's important to remember that many castles and manors were built and maintained by local artisans, masons, glaziers, carpenters whose knowledge of climate and material shaped the buildings more than any formal architectural theory. A well-fitted shutter, a carefully angled window opening, a wisely placed alcove, these were not accidents. They were the result of generations of hands-on experience, passed down and preserved through stone and wood. In this way, the people of medieval Europe were not just passive victims of the cold. They responded. They experimented. They learned from frost and storm. Their walls and windows reflect 1,000 years of small decisions, each one a step closer to warmth. But in all of this adaptation, what about the people who had no stone walls at all? What was winter like for the peasants living in timber-framed cottages, with open hearths and thatched roofs? How did the humblest homes resist the cold? And what did a winter night look like in a rural medieval village? Step away now from the towering castles and fortified manors. Walk down the muddy lane that winds between the hedgerows, past the smoke-streaked sky, and into the folds of a small medieval village. It's late in the evening, winter. The sun has long set and a heavy frost has settled on the thatched roofs. A glow flickers through the crude wooden slats of a cottage. Inside there is no stone hearth, no arrow slit, no leaded glass. Just a single-room timber-framed house, shared by a family, some animals, and a draft that never seems to stop. Here, warmth is not architectural. It is personal. It is earned by labor, kept through habit, and shared out like food unevenly and never enough. The peasant cottage, structure and exposure. A typical peasant cottage in the Middle Ages was small, 1 or 2 rooms at most, built of wattle and daub walls, woven wooden slats covered in mud and straw, topped with a thatch roof. The floor was often bare earth. Windows, if present at all, were small, unglazed holes covered with cloth or wooden shutters. No insulation, no sealed beams, no solid doors. The walls cracked with the seasons. Rain leaked in at the corners. In the winter, the cold was not something that entered the cottage, it was already there. Smoke from the central open hearth, set directly on the ground, drifted upward through a hole in the roof or a louver in the thatch. In wealthier peasant homes, a rudimentary hooded chimney might be added to help funnel smoke. But for most, the interior air was thick with soot, the smell of burning peat or wood lingering in every blanket, tunic, and braid of hair. Windows holds more than features. The word window does little justice to what most peasants had in place of glass. Openings for light were cut into the daub walls rarely larger than a hand span. These were covered with oiled parchment, horn panes, or bits of cloth dipped in animal fat to make them slightly translucent. Shutters were hand-hewn planks nailed directly to the frame, often warped by moisture. Gaps let in wind. Rain slipped through in storms. In winter, these shutters were often sealed with clay or padded with straw and cloth to stop the worst of the drafts. Still, a breeze always found its way in. Villagers adjusted their homes, seasonally stuffing cracks with moss, banking snow against outside walls for insulation, and spreading rushes across the floor. The rushes didn't just soften footsteps, they helped trap warmth and soak up moisture, though they quickly grew foul. The heart of the home. In these small cottages, the hearth was not just for cooking, it was life itself. The family gathered around it not for leisure but survival. Everyone sat close, parents, children, elders. Animals, goats, chickens, dogs were often brought inside in winter, either tied in the corners or allowed to roam freely. Their body heat added to the room, so did their smells. The fire rarely went out, even at night. It was carefully banked with ash to keep embers smoldering until morning. A cold hearth meant a cold start to the day and difficulty lighting a new flame in damp weather. A cooking pot might hang over the fire, bubbling through the night with leftover stew or porridge. The smell of food and smoke fused into the air. In many homes, the hearth was the only source of heat, light, and comfort. Sleeping in shifts and layers. Beds, if present, were few. A family might share one straw mattress, laid in a wooden frame or directly on the floor. Children slept together, parents curled near the fire, elders nestled in corners under wool cloaks or sheepskin pelts. Others slept on benches or straw piles layered with old cloth. Bedding was scarce. Blankets, if owned, were passed down, patched, and protected. In winter, people often slept fully clothed or nearly so. Woolen hose, linen shifts, thick outer garments, and caps were worn through the night. Feet were wrapped in cloth, hands tucked into sleeves. Every scrap of heat mattered. People also slept in shifts. When someone rose to tend the fire or use the latrine, another might take their place near the coals. Children were moved from warmer to colder spots to even out the suffering. Warmth was a rotating privilege, not a guarantee. Coping with the cold. There was no question of beating the cold. One endured it, and in enduring it, villagers developed customs that reflected both hardship and resilience. Feasting days, like Christmas or Candlemas, became rare opportunities for extra warmth when ovens were used, when ale was warmed, when neighbors gathered for collective comfort. Sleeping with animals was not uncommon. A family dog under the covers or a calf in the corner could make a difference on the coldest nights. Body heat was shared without ceremony. Children slept with parents. Grandparents slept with grandchildren. There was no luxury of space. And perhaps most importantly, villagers went to bed early and rose with the sun. In winter, they lived in a state of semi-hibernation, conserving energy as much as possible. Even social customs adapted. There was less visiting, fewer outdoor chores, and more hours spent near the fire. The wisdom in simplicity. Peasant homes were crude by modern standards, but they were also deeply responsive to their environment. Walls could be repaired quickly. Roofs thatched with local reeds were easy to patch. Windows, small and few, minimized exposure. And within these small homes, generations lived and died. Stories were told by firelight, songs sung, simple prayers offered. Sleep, though often cold and interrupted, was still cherished. In many ways, the architecture of the poor was honest. It made no promises it couldn't keep. But it also offered lessons, that warmth is not always a matter of design, but of habit, resilience, and the quiet will to endure. As we leave this humble cottage behind and return to the broader world of stone and straw, consider this. How did these homes and the people within them change as the medieval world gave way to early modern comforts like coal heating and chimneys? And did the cold ever truly go away, or just find new forms in new kinds of buildings? Story 5. The layered reality of medieval bedding. The room is dim. A single candle flickers beside a tall wooden bed, its posts carved with ivy and stars. Heavy curtains hang loosely from the frame, drawn partly open. Within, thick quilts are piled high blankets of wool, furs from fox and squirrel, feather-stuffed mattresses, and beneath it all, a coarse linen sheet worn thin with use. The fireplace nearby glows with quiet embers, casting a soft warmth across the stone floor. You approach the bed, not as a guest, but as one of the countless people in the medieval world who slept in such layered refuge from the cold. This was not luxury, it was necessity. In a world without central heating, where stone walls retained the cold and winters lasted long, the bed became more than just a place to sleep. It was a fortress of warmth, a private world built one layer at a time. In this story, we explore the surprisingly sophisticated world of medieval bedding, from the humblest peasant pallet to the grandest noble bed, examining how the materials, construction, and customs around sleep formed a vital part of daily survival. The medieval bed, function and status. Beds in the Middle Ages were both practical tools and status symbols. To sleep elevated from the ground, enclosed in drapery on a cushion of feathers or wool, was not common. It was a mark of wealth, or at least of stable comfort. In noble households, the bed was often the most expensive item of furniture. In wills and inventories, beds were listed with care: frame, hangings, mattress, bolsters, blankets, furs. A noble's bed might travel with them when they moved between estates, disassembled and carted with other household goods. For those lower on the social ladder, a bed might consist of little more than a pallet of straw, perhaps placed on a wooden frame or directly on the earth floor. Yet even here there was ingenuity: layers of cloth, a folded cloak, animal skins. Each layer added insulation, each adjustment learned from years of cold seasons. Mattresses, the foundation of sleep. The word mattress comes from the Arabic matra, a place where cushions are thrown. The medieval mattress reflected that heritage: a large sack filled with straw, chaff, moss, or wool, laid on a wooden bed frame or directly on slats of wood or ropes. For the poor, straw was the most common fill. It was readily available, easy to replace, and moderately warm. However, it flattened quickly and had to be restuffed regularly. In some households, mattresses were turned and fluffed weekly, especially during colder months. In wealthier homes, wool or feathers were preferred. Wool retained heat better and didn't collapse as quickly. Feathers, though far more expensive, offered softness and insulation. Featherbeds were considered a luxury, heavy, deep, and comforting, but they required maintenance: shaking, airing, and sometimes heating to prevent dampness and mildew. Mattresses were enclosed in a linen or wool ticking, a tightly woven fabric designed to hold the stuffing inside. The ticking might be coarse or fine, dyed or left natural, patched over the years and passed down through generations. Sheets and linens, the breathable barrier. Directly atop the mattress came the sheet, often linen in well-off households, sometimes hemp or coarse wool in poorer ones. Linen was prized for its breathability, ability to wick moisture, and relative softness against the skin. It was also one of the few bed coverings that were washed regularly. A typical bed had at least 2 sheets, one beneath the sleeper, one above. These sheets were often tied to the mattress to keep them from shifting. In cold weather, some people layered multiple sheets to trap warmth. Linens were expensive both in material and in labor. The spinning, weaving, and sewing of even a single sheet took days. For this reason, they were valued and carefully stored. Servants might air them in the sun to remove moisture and kill lice, or scent them with dried lavender, rose, or chamomile to mask odors. Blankets and furs, the outer defenses. Blankets called coverlets, bedclothes, or simply bed covers were typically woven wool. Thick, heavy, and coarse, they were designed to trap heat and provide weight, anchoring the sleeper beneath a thermal shell. In colder climates, households added fur coverings. Fox, squirrel known as vair, rabbit, or sheepskin were common. In grander homes, you might find ermine, sable, or lynx, especially among royalty or the wealthiest nobility. Furs were not only warmer, they were status symbols. Richer households often displayed their fur-trimmed bedclothes during the day, folding back the sheets and laying decorative cushions atop the blankets. But furs also required care. They attracted insects, trapped oils, and degraded without proper storage. During warmer months, they were hung in cool cellars or wrapped in cloth with herbs like mint or rosemary to ward off pests. Bed curtains and canopies, privacy and insulation. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of the medieval noble bed was the canopy and bed curtains. These served two primary functions. Insulation. Heavy wool or velvet curtains trapped body heat, creating a microclimate around the sleeper. In large, drafty chambers, the difference in temperature between the curtained bed and the room outside could be dramatic. Privacy. In an era when rooms were shared, often with servants or even guests, the bed became a private chamber within a public space. Curtains muted sound, blocked light, and offered a barrier against intrusion. Curtains were attached to a wooden frame, sometimes a full canopy, sometimes just rods attached to the bedposts. In wealthier households, these fabrics were elaborately embroidered, dyed in rich colors, and sometimes adorned with heraldic symbols. In simpler homes, bed curtains were rare. If used at all, they were made of coarse wool, perhaps even repurposed cloaks or old garments. Warming the bed. Before slipping beneath the covers, it was common in colder months to warm the bed itself. Warming pans, shallow brass or copper pans filled with hot embers, were passed between the sheets before bed. These were handled carefully to avoid scorching the fabric. Heated stones, wrapped in cloth, were placed at the foot of the bed or near the sleeper's torso. In some homes, the mattress itself was warmed in front of the fire and then quickly returned to the bed frame. And of course, body heat was shared. It was common for married couples, siblings, or even unrelated travelers to share a bed, less for social intimacy and more for warmth. The bed as a living space. In many households, especially among the nobility, the bed was not just for sleeping. It was a place of rest, reading, prayer, and even governance. Lords might receive guests while reclining. Women gave birth in bed. The dying often spent their final hours there, surrounded by family and clergy. Because of this, the bed was kept presentable. Servants arranged the coverings each morning, folded the curtains, and sometimes sprinkled herbs or perfumed waters to freshen the air. In great households, the bedchamber itself was part of the social architecture, semi-private, but often entered by stewards, maids, and companions. The layers of sleep. Together, all these components, mattress, sheets, blankets, furs, curtains, formed a system of warmth, comfort, and dignity. Each layer had a role. Each was a response to the cold reality of pre-modern life. But these beds also mirrored society. The more layers one had, the more protected one was from cold, from discomfort, from the outside world. And those with the fewest layers, sometimes no bed at all, faced the winter most directly. Yet even in the finest beds, the night brought uncertainty. Illness, dreams, waking in the cold, or the summons of duty. But what did it feel like to wake in such a bed? To rise before dawn, in a cold room, and begin the day again, remaking the bed, relighting the fire, and shaking out the furs before another long medieval night. The candle has long since burned out. The fire has faded to a dull, red shimmer. The air in the room is still and heavy. Somewhere outside in the gray haze of morning, a cock crows. You lie in bed warm, for now nestled between flattened wool blankets and a fur-lined coverlet, the thick curtains still drawn around your sleeping space. But morning has arrived, and like every day in the medieval world, the transition from sleep to wakefulness is neither leisurely nor luxurious. The cold waits beyond the curtain, and your body knows it. The first breath you take feels sharp and damp. The stone walls, still chilled from the night, have not yet begun to release the mild warmth they stored the day before. You can see your breath. If you are a noble, a servant may soon knock. If you are a servant, no one will knock. You are already late. Rising from a medieval bed, particularly in winter, was an act of quiet resilience. Throwing back the covers. The moment the curtain is drawn, the cold rushes in. The layers that cocooned you all night, linen, wool, fur, no longer serve as protection. They become obstacles, needing to be folded, smoothed, and stored properly before the day can begin. Servants tasked with tending their master's chamber would arrive just after dawn to air the bed. They carefully turned back the covers, fluffed the mattress, and allowed the moisture from sleep, sweat, breath, condensation to begin dissipating. In households without this help, the bed's occupant performed these tasks themselves. Moisture control was not cosmetic. If bedding remained damp, mildew and lice could flourish. Beds were rarely washed in full. Airing and sun exposure were the primary forms of hygiene. Feather beds in particular were prone to clumping. To maintain loft and insulation, they had to be vigorously shaken. This was typically done with a good beating, sometimes quite literally with rods or paddles. The bed might then be left to rest near the fire or a sunny window if the weather allowed. Dressing against the morning chill. Even in wealthier homes, dressing in a cold room was a hasty affair. Linen undergarments might be warmed near the hearth, but most mornings people stepped into stiff, chilled clothing with speed and purpose. Children were quickly wrapped. Older bodies stretched stiffly into layered hose, chemises, tunics, and cloaks. Nightwear often doubled as daywear. Many people simply slept in the garments they intended to wear the next day, especially during the coldest months. Boots or shoes, left by the fire the night before, were quickly slipped on, often with an extra cloth wrapped around the toes for warmth. For nobles, dressing was a social event. A lady might be attended by maids who helped brush out her hair, lace her gown, or select a particular fur-lined cloak. A lord might be assisted by a valet who helped fasten his hose, boots, and belt while discussing the day's tasks. This wasn't just about luxury, it was about layers. More than protection, these clothes became insulation against stone floors and drafty rooms. The fire, morning's first task. Whether in a hall, a private chamber, or a peasant cottage, one of the first tasks each morning was the revival of the hearth. In wealthier homes, a servant or page would rekindle the coals, gently raking the ashes to reveal any lingering embers. If they were still hot, kindling would be added, carefully coaxing the fire back to life. If not, flint and steel would be struck, and the long process of fire starting begun from scratch. For the peasant household, this task might fall to the eldest child or mother, who had carefully banked the fire the night before. A cold hearth meant a cold breakfast if breakfast came at all. Until the fire was restored, the room remained hostile. Water in jugs might have frozen. Chamber pots stood cold and full. Warmth like food had to be earned again every day. Folding and storing the bedding. After the bed was aired, it was carefully remade or dismantled. In households with limited space, mattresses might be folded and stored during the day to allow the bed frame to be used for seating or work. In larger homes, beds were made with care. Linen sheets smoothed, blankets straightened, pillows plumped. Furs were brushed, curtains tied neatly back. In many noble homes, the bed was displayed, not hidden, an indicator of refinement and taste. Bedding was rotated with the seasons. Heavy fur coverlets were replaced with lighter wool blankets come spring. Feather beds were aired more often in damp weather. Clean linens were a mark of good household management, and their maintenance fell to trusted servants or, in monastic communities, to dedicated lay brethren. Scent and sleep hygiene. The medieval bed, like every part of the home, was infused with scent and texture. Herbs such as lavender, chamomile, thyme, and rosemary were commonly dried and placed between sheets or under pillows, not only for their calming effects, but to deter pests like lice and fleas. Linen was occasionally sprinkled with rosewater or vinegar, especially in noble homes. In monasteries, clean bedding was part of the rhythm of the year, with scheduled washings and seasonal rotations recorded in detailed inventory books. Still, most people, especially those of the lower classes, washed their linens only a few times per year, often at great effort. The labor of hauling water, heating it, scrubbing fabric by hand, and drying it in winter conditions was immense. For many, it was simpler to air out bedding and rely on herbs to preserve a sense of cleanliness. Beds in shared spaces. Not everyone had a chamber to themselves. In many homes, the bed shared its space with children, servants, guests, or even animals. Privacy was minimal, space was communal. The rising of one sleeper often stirred the rest. In monastic dormitories, dozens of monks might rise at the same time, responding to the call of matins, the first prayer of the day. Their beds were small, simple, and austere. Sheets were minimal. Blankets were wool, and beds were often permanently assigned but spaced closely in shared halls. In peasant homes, a single bed might sleep parents and children. Younger children might sleep on pallets on the floor, while infants shared the parents' bedding. As a result, bed-making routines were family efforts, or abandoned entirely in favor of maintaining warmth throughout the day. Reflections on the morning. To wake in a medieval bed was not necessarily to wake rested, but to wake prepared for labor, for cold, for duty. The act of getting out of bed meant something. It meant confronting the world again, one filled with hard stone, raw wind, long hours, and the endless need to stay warm. And yet, the bed was always waiting at day's end, remade, reshaped, ready. Its layers of cloth, of custom, of care told a quiet story of human perseverance. But how did these rituals of bedding change over time? What happened when chimneys became common and coal replaced firewood? Did warmth finally win, or did it simply change the way we layered ourselves against the cold? It is the 16th century now. The great beds of the nobility still dominate private chambers, their carved posts rising like columns in the half-dark. The heavy curtains remain, embroidered with family crests and guarded by lions or eagles in brass relief. But something is different. In the corner of the room, narrow and vertical, rises a chimney. Not a smoke hood, not a louvered hole in the roof. A true chimney, structured, lined, and built to draw smoke efficiently from a private hearth. A quiet revolution has arrived in the world of warmth, and with it, the architecture of sleep is beginning to change. This final section traces the evolution of warmth and bedding, as technology, materials, and ideas about comfort transformed the medieval bed into something both simpler and more modern. The rise of the chimney. By the late medieval period and into the early Renaissance, chimneys began to appear with increasing regularity in domestic architecture, first in castles, then in manors, and eventually in townhouses. Chimneys allowed smaller, safer fireplaces to be installed in upper rooms. They removed smoke efficiently, making bedrooms less stifling and more pleasant. They allowed for controlled, overnight heating, with fires banked and maintained longer. The consequences for sleep were significant. Rooms could now be warm before and after bed, not just momentarily heated with warming pans. Beds near the hearth became less dependent on thick bedding, though such layers remained common for status and comfort. Coal, a new fuel, a new flame. The increasing use of coal in the 16th and 17th centuries further altered the landscape of heat and bedding. Unlike wood, coal burned longer and hotter and was easier to maintain overnight. It required a flue or chimney for proper ventilation, but it meant that homes could stay warm more consistently, especially in urban areas where wood was expensive or scarce. With coal came the iron grate, and the bed no longer had to be positioned close to the fireplace to benefit. Heat filled the room more evenly, and with better heat came less reliance on furs, on feather beds, and on layered insulation. Beds became simpler in some homes still made with craftsmanship, but with fewer layers. In time, the very idea of sleeping communally began to fade among the upper classes, replaced with the concept of privacy and personal space. The changing bed. By the 17th century, the structure of the bed itself began to shift. Bed frames grew lower and broader, no longer needing tall posts to support curtains in many homes. Mattress quality improved, with better stuffing, uniform ticking, and eventually sprung bases in the centuries to come. Bedding became lighter and more varied, with new fabrics like cotton and imported linens from the colonies. Down comforters, early duvets began to appear in parts of Europe, replacing multiple layers of wool with a single, soft, insulating cover. In wealthier households, bedding was increasingly associated with taste and refinement, rather than with basic survival. The look and feel of a bed began to matter more than its weight or insulation. Warmth was still valued, but now it could be purchased not layered with effort, but engineered with design. Urban sleep, the bed in the growing town. As cities expanded, the bed became a commodity. In the homes of the growing merchant and artisan classes, beds were still valuable, but no longer unique. Standardized frames, pre-woven sheets, and manufactured blankets began to replace hand-sewn heirlooms. Fireplaces in bedrooms, though still a luxury, were more common. Chimneys were regulated, and coal was sold by the cartful. In winter, sleep was still cold, but no longer brutal. There was no longer a need to sleep fully clothed or to share a bed with several family members unless poverty demanded it. Even among the working class, heated interiors became more attainable, particularly in regions with coal mining and fuel access. The heavy furs and feather beds of the past remained in rural areas, but in towns, they slowly gave way to lighter, simpler beds. Rituals that remained. Despite all these changes, some medieval customs persisted. Bed airing remained common. People continued to open windows, when possible, shake blankets, and sprinkle linens with herbs or waters. Seasonal bedding continued. Heavy blankets and wool returned each autumn, stored again in spring. Bed sharing did not disappear overnight. It remained normal in boarding houses, among apprentices, in inns, and among the poor. And most notably, the idea of the bed as a sanctuary, as a space both private and symbolic, endured. Even as heating technology improved, the act of retreating to bed after a day of labor remained a moment of comfort, of enclosure, of body needing rest. The decline of the layered bed. By the 18th century, the thick, many-layered beds of the Middle Ages had become the subject of nostalgia and satire. Writers described the weight of the covers, the ritual of climbing in, the length of time it took to warm up. Fewer people needed such protection anymore. But those layers told a story. Each blanket, each sheet, each fur or feather had once represented a defense against the night. In their absence, something of that quiet battle was lost. People were warmer now, more comfortable, but also more separated from the communal struggle that had once defined winter. Modern beds would evolve further into iron frames, mass-produced mattresses, electric blankets, and climate-controlled bedrooms. But the echoes of medieval sleep remain in the language we use and the habits we keep. Turning down the bed, fluffing pillows, tucking in. We may not fight the frost quite as fiercely, but we still climb into our own soft fortresses seeking warmth, seeking quiet, seeking the renewal that comes with sleep. And yet in the flicker of a candle, in the hush of a cold room, we might wonder, what would it be like to return to those nights, layered beneath wool and fur, listening to the wind scrape at the shutters, the fire hissing its last? Could we sleep, as they did, with the cold so close and still find rest? Story 6. Surviving Winter in the Thatched Cottage. You wake in a dark room before the sun has risen. You're not in a castle or monastery, but in a single-room timber-framed cottage built from mud, wattle, and thatch. The roof creaks in the wind. The air is cold and smells faintly of damp earth, smoke, and something boiling in yesterday's pot. The bed, if you had one, was a straw-filled sack. More likely, you slept under a heavy woolen cloak near the fire pit in the center of the floor, with your children curled up at your side, and the family goat dozing nearby. Welcome to the daily winter reality of the medieval peasant, where warmth was not just a comfort, but a question of survival. In this story, we turn away from the carved posts and feather beds of the nobility and look closely at the most common living experience in medieval Europe: life around the peasant's hearth. The structure, small, simple, exposed. The average medieval peasant home was small, often a single room, maybe two if the family was lucky, or had a second generation living under the same roof. Walls were made of wattle and daub woven branches packed with clay, mud, straw, and dung. The roof was thatch, bundles of straw tied over wooden rafters, excellent at shedding water, but poor at holding in heat. There was no insulation as we know it, no glass windows, no fitted doors. The floor was usually compacted dirt, occasionally covered with rushes or straw. During the winter months, moisture collected inside, freezing overnight and thawing into mud during the day. Yet these homes were resilient, built with local materials and adapted over generations. Repairs were constant, often done by hand. Every season changed how the home functioned, and in winter, everything revolved around the hearth. The hearth, central, essential, and imperfect. The hearth was not just where food was cooked. It was the source of warmth, the light of the home, and the symbol of life itself. In the simplest homes, the hearth was a raised fire pit or a ring of stones placed in the center of the room. In slightly wealthier cottages, it might be set against a wall. Chimneys were rare. Smoke rose into the thatch or drifted out through a hole in the roof, called a louvre. In many homes, the air inside was perpetually smoky, and soot blackened the beams above. Despite this, the hearth was tended with care. Firewood was precious, gathered from common lands or gleaned from hedgerows. In wooded areas, access to fuel was easier. In deforested regions, people burned peat, dried dung, or brushwood. Every scrap of fuel was saved, dried, and stacked for the long months of frost. The fire was rarely allowed to die completely. At night, it was banked with ashes to preserve embers. In the morning, those embers were coaxed back to life with kindling. A cold hearth was an ill omen, hard to relight, and harder still on fingers already stiff from the night air. The shared warmth of living beings. Human bodies weren't the only source of warmth in a peasant cottage. During the winter, animals were often brought inside not out of affection, but necessity. A cow, a pig, chickens, or a goat might sleep in the same room as the family. Their body heat added to the ambient warmth, and their nearness protected them from the cold and from theft. There was no sense of indoors and barn in the way we think of it now. The home was everything: kitchen, bedroom, stable, shelter. In many cottages, a wooden partition, if present, separated the people from the animals, but often it was just shared space. The sounds of snuffling, chewing, and cloven hooves were as familiar as the crackle of firewood. Children often slept closest to the hearth, sometimes even on top of the built-up oven or hearthstone if it had retained any warmth. Elders or the sick might be propped up near the wall, wrapped in cloaks or blankets. The daily struggle to keep warm. Unlike the noble who had woolen bedclothes and embroidered canopies, the peasant layered what they had: Woolen tunics, old cloaks, scraps of linen, and sheepskins. These garments were worn by day and by night. There was no changing into night clothes. You slept in what you worked in, wrapping yourself tighter against the cold. If the fire burned hot enough, hands and feet were warmed briefly in the morning. Water that had frozen in buckets overnight was thawed near the coals. Breakfast, if available, was usually hot. Pottage, gruel, or bread softened in broth. Children were tasked with gathering sticks, helping keep the fire alive. Men might cut wood or retrieve peat from frozen bogs. Women stirred the pot, mended torn cloaks, or swept out damp straw to replace it with slightly less damp straw. Every task was influenced by the cold, every moment structured around how to keep the heat from slipping away. The communal fire and cultural tradition. In many villages, the hearth was more than a physical necessity, it was a center of tradition and storytelling. Evening meals were taken near it. Songs were sung. Children learned their first words staring into its glow. Some believed the hearth held a spirit or should be respected with prayers or tokens to ward off ill luck. In certain regions, ash from the hearth was scattered across thresholds as protection. Ember rituals were performed at year's end to ensure health and harvest. Fire was both feared and revered. And yet accidents were common: a spark on a thatched roof, a log rolled too far, a child burned. The very thing that preserved life could, with one mistake, destroy a home. A temporary refuge. Still, for all its shortcomings, the peasant hearth gave more than it took. It was the only consistent warmth in a cold and fragile world. It was where newborns were washed and old men died. It was where the sick were laid and the bread was baked. And in the middle of winter, when snow covered the fields and the roads were blocked, and the castle fires were stoked with cut logs hauled by the village men, this hearth was all they had. But it would not burn forever. Wood would run short, peat would grow damp, the wind would sneak through the thatch. And so the question lingered: how long could they keep the fire alive, and what happened if it finally went out? The morning light barely filters through the oiled cloth covering the cottage's tiny window. The hearth's glow is a memory, now ashes cool, embers faint. A child coughs in the corner, wrapped in a damp woolen cloak. The air smells of peat smoke, wet rushes, and sleep. You feel the cold in your bones before you stand. The fire must be revived. In this section, we explore the daily burden of maintaining heat in a medieval peasant's home, how fuel was gathered, how fires were preserved, and how the looming threat of a cold hearth shaped every aspect of rural survival. The endless task: gathering fuel. Heat did not come freely in the Middle Ages, not for peasants. While the nobility had estates with managed forests, peasants were often restricted from cutting trees by law. In manorial systems, woodlands were protected, used for hunting, managed for timber, or set aside for lordly use. Peasants who took wood without permission risked fines, punishment, or even eviction. Instead, they turned to dead wood, fallen branches gathered from permitted commons or verges. Gorse and brush, hardy shrubs burned quickly but were easy to collect. Peat, cut from boggy lands, dried in stacks, and used especially in areas with few trees. Dung, from cattle or horses, dried and stored for winter fires, an unpleasant but vital resource. Women and children often collected firewood as part of daily chores. In winter, this meant trudging through snow or mud, hands raw and clothes soaked. Fuel was tied in bundles, carried on backs, and stored wherever it could be kept dry, under eaves, beside the hearth, or hung from rafters. There was never enough. A good fire meant a rare day of warmth. A bad day, rain-soaked wood, no embers left, meant a cold house, cold food, and often cold sickness. Fire management and the banked ember. Knowing how to maintain a fire was a skill passed through generations. Every night the fire was banked, meaning smothered with ash to preserve its internal heat. A well-banked fire would keep a core of embers alive until morning, reducing the need to start a new flame from scratch. Tools were simple: tongs, fire pokers, a bellows if the household was lucky. Kindling was everything: dry moss, bark, or straw twisted into small bundles. If the embers had died overnight, the process began again with flint and steel, striking sparks onto charred linen or touchwood. This was not easy. Cold fingers, damp kindling, and weak tools often meant long mornings before heat returned. A home with a reliable fire starting method was a home with higher survival odds. Some families shared fire with neighbors. A child might be sent to the next cottage with an iron pot to borrow embers, cradled carefully in straw or cloth to keep them alight. The community's fire became as important as one's own. When the fire died, to lose the fire was more than an inconvenience, it was a threat. A cold hearth meant no cooked food, no boiling water, no sterilized cloths for washing or wounds. It meant the chill would settle into beds and joints, into the backs of children and the chests of the elderly. Illness came quickly. Colds turned to fevers, joints stiffened, sleep became fitful. In the harshest winters, a cold hearth could precede death, especially for the weak. And so, when a fire went out, the effort to reignite it became desperate. Dry rushes were burned, old shoes, scraps of cloth, anything flammable was pressed into service. Even thatch might be torn from the roof, risking leaks, just to feel warmth again. In such moments, the emotional weight of the hearth became clear. It wasn't just physical comfort, it was the symbolic center of life. Its silence was a signal that something had gone wrong. The ritual of fire maintenance. Despite the hardship, there were rituals, small, daily gestures that kept fire central. Ashes were swept out carefully, collected, and used in soap making or soil enrichment. Embers were stirred with reverence, especially at dawn. Children were taught never to waste heat, to stay close, to cover their heads, to watch the flames. Elders told stories by firelight, linking warmth with memory and tradition. In some homes, prayers were spoken as the fire was banked, quiet invocations that it would still be alive in the morning. In others, tokens were hung in the hearth: iron nails, sprigs of rowan, or carved charms to ward off spirits that might steal the warmth. The hearth was rarely left unguarded. Even if everyone left the house, someone returned before nightfall to check the coals, repack the wood, and ensure the family's survival through the dark. Smoke, soot, and suffering. But this warmth came at a price. Without chimneys, smoke from the fire filled the house. It blackened walls, ceilings, and lungs. Children developed persistent coughs. Eyes watered constantly. Visitors often remarked that peasant homes felt more like smokehouses than dwellings. Still, it was better than cold. Some homes developed smoke shelves or built-in hoods to direct the worst of it. Others left windows slightly open, creating drafts that lessened smoke but worsened the cold. It was always a trade-off: heat or breath, fire or air. Innovation and ingenuity. Despite the limitations, peasants found ways to improve their lot. Small innovations born of need. Clay ovens built into the side of the hearth held heat for hours. Stones warmed by the fire were wrapped in cloth and placed in beds. Heated bricks were used to dry boots and thaw frozen pots. Fire dogs ironed stands, improved airflow under logs, producing more efficient burns. Even the layout of the home evolved, placing sleeping areas closer to the hearth, raising beds off the ground to avoid cold drafts, using wooden planks instead of earth for sleeping pallets. And perhaps most ingeniously, sharing heat. Whether with kin, animals, or neighbors, warmth was treated as a communal resource. Fire as memory. To the medieval peasant, the fire was not only functional, it was a keeper of the past. It was where births had been warmed, where the sick had been soothed, where bread had risen and ashes of the dead had cooled. It was the one constant across generations, across seasons, across fortunes. And yet, even fire could be lost. A bad winter, a cracked roof, an illness that kept one from gathering wood, these could extinguish what no wind could reach. And so the question returns each morning: can the fire be kept alive today? And if not, who will help rekindle it before the night falls again? The day winds down, the sun sinks beyond the distant woods, the wind picks up, rattling the wooden shutters and sliding under the door's uneven frame. Inside the cottage, the fire still burns barely. A woman bends to stir the coals. A boy stacks rushes in the corner. An elder folds a tattered woolen shawl around her shoulders and moves closer to the hearth. It has been another day of survival, not prosperity, not even comfort, just warmth enough to get through to the next sunrise. As we close this story, we reflect on how the peasant hearth, fragile, smoky, and dim, was also a symbol of resilience, a practical tool for survival, and a sacred center of family life. In a world shaped by cold and scarcity, the simple fire meant everything. The evening routine: tending, sharing, preparing. As darkness fell, the peasant family drew close to the hearth. The room, already small, seemed to contract further in the candleless night. The flames offered the only light. Meals were taken here, often reheated pottage or bread softened in broth. Bowls were shared. So were spoons. Conversation was sparse in the depths of winter, not out of sadness but fatigue. The cold took energy, so did the labor of staying alive. Children sat nearest to the fire, often at their parents' feet or curled against their legs. Elders were given the warmest place. The rest of the family fanned out from their sleeping in layers, wrapped in cloaks, sometimes resting upright against the wall if the floor was damp or already occupied. Before sleep, the fire was banked, once more ash piled gently over the coals, with a prayer or murmured instruction to the youngest child: don't let it die. The fire as inheritance. The fire wasn't just for warmth, it was an inherited responsibility. Each generation learned the skills: how to light it, how to preserve it, how to stretch a small bundle of fuel through the longest night. Daughters learned from mothers, sons from fathers, neighbors taught neighbors. The loss of a fire in one cottage might be answered by a gift of hot coals from the next. Take care with it. Wrap it tight. In this way, heat itself became a shared resource, not just physically, but symbolically. The village survived not because every hearth blazed equally, but because those with a little more gave to those with less. It was this quiet mutual dependence that defined winter in the countryside. Winter hardships and hearth deaths. Still, there were years when the winter outlasted the woodpile. Famine years, years of illness, years of war or tax or early frost. During such times, the hearth might go cold permanently. Hearths were sometimes left untended for days as families buried the old or the very young. In plague years, entire households might perish, leaving fires to burn out on their own, silent signals of death from afar. Travelers passing through villages could count the homes that lived or died by the smoke from their rooftops. A cold chimney was a warning, a grief, a call. But even in mourning, the hearth was central. Funeral wakes were held around it. Ashes of the dead might be buried near it. The warmth that once sustained life became the backdrop to its ending. When the hearth changes, as the medieval world shifted, so too did the hearth. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, chimneys began to appear even in simpler homes. They were rudimentary at first, brick flues added to one end of the house, but they changed how heat circulated. The smoke no longer clung to the rafters. The air became more breathable. Gradually, homes were divided into separate rooms, with the hearth moved against an outer wall. The central fire pit disappeared. Privacy increased. Warmth decreased. Families no longer lived around a single flame but spread apart. Beds moved farther from the fire. Rituals changed, but the memory remained. Even in new homes, children were told about the days when we all slept in the kitchen, when the fire was at the heart of the house. A legacy in the ashes. Today, nothing remains of most medieval peasant homes. The wood has long since rotted, the thatch blown away, the daub crumbled, but archaeologists still find traces of the hearth-discolored soil, burnt stones, the blackened basin of what once held a daily fire. And in these marks, they see not just structure but story. Stories of early risings, of cold hands rubbed together, of newborns wrapped and placed near the warmth, of bread baking, of fire shared, of the quiet knowledge that even the smallest fire, if preserved carefully, could last through the longest winter. The hearth as history. The peasant's hearth tells a history not written in royal records or illuminated manuscripts. It's a history of bodies and breath, of ash and effort, of the human will to keep something glowing in the dark. While castles and churches showcased wealth and power, the peasant's hearth showcased something subtler: continuity, a family line, a habit repeated, a skill remembered, a resilience passed down like a name. And perhaps in a cold night of our own, we might think of that hearth dim, smoky, imperfect in wonder. Would we have kept the fire alive? And if it failed, would someone have given us their last ember to start again?